Their colleagues, their participants, their guests. Today we have Dr. Jeremy Koons from Georgetown University of Qatar. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He received his PhD in philosophy from Georgetown University in 1998, and he held many teaching positions at American University of Beirut, Hong Kong University, and Stonehill College in Massachusetts. He has taught a wide variety of philosophy courses on ethics, social and political philosophy, epistemology, philosophy of mind and language, metaphysics, and philosophy of religion. Today, we are extremely honored to have Professor Koons with us, and Mr. Göksel and myself will be trying to moderate. And the floor is yours, Professor Koons.
Welcome to DPCH, Dr. Koons.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to speak. My plan was just to try to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then anyone can ask any questions that they have. So I want to start off with a question. And the question is, what would happen to a group of kids, like teenaged boys, if they were stranded somewhere, like on a desert island with no adult supervision? Would they continue to follow the rules of civilization? Would they resort to violence and savagery? Basically, the question is, do people have a selfish and violent nature that always needs to be controlled by the threat of punishment? Well, William Golding asked this question in his famous novel, Lord of the Flies, which some of you may have read. In it, a group of boys, they're stranded alone on an island, they're shipwrecked on an island. The novel is sort of it's like a fictional thought experiment. What would happen if a bunch of humans, boys in this case, were thrown together with no authority to govern them? Golding's answer is clear. By the end of the novel, the boys have descended into the worst kind of tribalism and savagery. 3 of the boys are dead. When they're finally rescued, one of the boys wept for the end of innocence and for the darkness in man's heart. And you can see here a still from one of the movie versions of this novel. The book has sold over 10 million copies, and it's often thought to convey something important about humanity, our selfishness, our brutality, our inability to cooperate and live together without threat and force keeping us in line. Golding's book is popular, I think, because it's a story that confirms for what a lot of people already believe about the worst in humanity. The question is, though, what would really happen in such a case? As it turns out, Golding's thought experiment happened in real life, although more than a decade after Golding published his book. In 1965, 6 teenaged Tongan schoolboys, bored and rebellious, as teenaged boys tend to be, ran away from school. They stole a boat, and they hoped to sail for adventure. Well, it didn't work out. They ran into rough weather, and they were shipwrecked on an island where they were stranded for 15 months until being rescued by a passing sailor. How did they behave? Did Golding's prediction come to pass? On the contrary, they cooperated. In his memoirs, the captain who rescued the boys said, by the time we arrived, the boys had set up a small commune with food garden, hollowed out tree trunks to store rainwater, a gymnasium with curious weights, a badminton court, chicken pens, and a permanent fire, all from handiwork, an old knife blade, and much determination. How did these boys survive? Well, here's how they did. The kids agreed to work in teams of 2, drawing up a strict roster for garden, kitchen, and guard duty. Sometimes they quarreled, but whenever that happened, they solved it by imposing a timeout. Seems like a very modern remedy for misbehavior. Their days began and ended with song and prayer. Kolo, whom you see in the picture here holding his guitar, fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires salvaged from their wrecked boat, an instrument that the boat captain has kept all these years. And he played the guitar for the other boys to help lift their spirits. Nor did the boys abuse the weak or the injured. One of the boys slipped and fell one day. He fell off a cliff and broke his leg. The other boys picked their way down after him and helped him back to the top. They set his leg using sticks and leaves. After they were rescued, the local physician expressed astonishment at the boy's perfectly healed leg. The truth is, humans are naturally inclined toward cooperation. It's actually the key to our success as a species. And the successes of the human race are remarkable. We live on every continent. We even live in space. We have transformed the face of the earth. We have created art, literature, and poetry. We've uncovered many of the secret workings of the universe, from the structure of the atom to the evolution of galaxies. Now, most of us think that the reason humans are so successful is because we are the smartest species that has ever lived. And I will grant you, humans are pretty smart, but other animals are smart too. And for your edification, I will give you a video of a dog who has learned how to sled. Pretty smart dog, I think you'll agree. Other animals can learn from experience. They can solve complicated problems. They can even use tools. Our success is not solely or even mostly, oh, I think we need to watch that again. Our success is not solely or even mostly a product of our intelligence. What truly separates humans from other animals is our capacity for cooperation. That is what separates humans. Now, non-human animals don't cooperate in the same way that humans do. Animals engage in behavior that looks cooperative, but it's not really. So consider, for example, how animals hunt. Lots of animals engage in coordinated pack hunting. Well, Michael Tomasello, he's written a lot about cooperation in humans. He discusses how chimpanzees, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire hunt monkeys in a way that looks very organized and cooperative. So the chimpanzees have a shared goal and they take complementary roles in their hunting. So one individual chases the prey, the others climb trees and prevent the prey from changing direction. So as Tomasello notes, when we describe the hunt in this way, it looks like a paradigmatic case of cooperative behavior. But this is a misleading way of describing this behavior. We're projecting onto the chimpanzees our behavior of how we, as cooperating humans, would organize such a hunt, rather than simply trying to understand from the chimpanzee point of view what they are actually doing. On closer examination, we see that each chimpanzee is merely trying to maximize its own chances of getting the kill for itself. We can especially see this because once the kill is made, the chimpanzee making the kill will do everything possible not to have to share with others. They don't like to share. Tomasello writes, the chimpanzee who actually makes the kill immediately attempts to avoid others by stealing away from the kill site, if possible, or by climbing to the end of a branch to restrict the access of other chimpanzees. That's not how humans are. Research into the behavior of human hunter-gatherer societies paints a very, very different picture. Human hunting is fully cooperative. Only in this way have humans been able to hunt prey, such as mammoths, that no individual could successfully hunt alone. Also, and this is crucial, it's well established in both the archaeological record and the anthropological record that sharing of meat from the hunt is virtually universal, not only among members of the hunt who didn't take part in the kill, but also among people who didn't take part in the hunt at all, people who stayed back in the village. The hunt is not merely undertaken cooperatively, it's undertaken for the benefit of everyone. Cooperation is evident in almost everything that humans do. Consider, for example, this Design Post-COVID Humanity course. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people have cooperated to make this course happen. There's been a fantastically complicated division of labor, with each person doing his or her part to promote the accomplishment of this shared goal that we all have. Some people helped with grant writing, some with administrative tasks, some with IT, some with giving lectures and teaching modules, some with student advising, and so on. Or, to take another example, consider the remarkable march of scientific progress. The title page of almost, if you spend your time browsing scientific journals, as I'm sure you do, you'll notice that the title page of almost every scientific article published these days looks like this, with dozens of authors, often writing up the results of experiments on which hundreds of scientists cooperated. Modern day scientific experiments are simply too complicated to be done by a single person and are often carried out by hundreds of scientists, each with his or her own specialty and their own task. But each is cooperating to produce an overall goal, namely the proof or disproof of a particular scientific hypothesis. The lesson, I hope, is clear. Any moderately complicated human activity relies on cooperation, whether it's building a house or running a business, launching a spacecraft, or making a movie or a television show. Virtually every product of human culture depends upon various people sharing a goal and cooperating in the achievement of this goal. And this cooperation can be seen as extending over generations. Each generation takes the achievements of past generations as its starting point, building on these to reach ever greater heights of human knowledge. Isaac Newton famously said, "If I have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants." Mathematicians today start off with thousands of years of work, passed on diligently from one generation to the next. They are, as it were, collaborators with the past. So too with engineers, scientists, artists, every other kind of creator. They start with the knowledge gained over centuries or even millennia of human progress. No other species has this kind of cumulative culture built on cooperation and collaboration. Given all of this, it's strange, weird, actually, that when scholars and academics, people like me and my colleagues, try to understand human behavior, they don't usually look at human behavior as cooperative. Scholars and academics almost always model human behavior, not in terms of cooperation among people pursuing a common goal. They model human behavior in terms of competition by individuals pursuing self-interest. In other words, academics, professors, researchers, these guys, they start from the same set of assumptions that William Golding did when he wrote Lord of the Flies. They start from the assumption that humans are inherently selfish and competitive, not cooperative. So consider an example of what is called the tragedy of the commons, which is maybe something that you all have heard about. This phrase refers to when a number of people have access to some common resource. Each person has an incentive to take more than their share, which means that the resource is depleted and ultimately destroyed. So just to give you a simple example so you can understand it, imagine a community that relies on fishing for survival. But let's also imagine that the fishing grounds for this community, they're overfished. People fish them too much. They catch too many fish. And so the fish population is declining. And so the survival of the community and its way of life is threatened, because if the fishing ground is destroyed, that's their way of life gone. What should the fishermen in this community do? Well, the obvious thing for them to do, I mean, I don't know if it's obvious, but it's sensible, is that they should impose a limit, a fishing limit. So all the fishermen should agree that as soon as you catch a certain amount, like, I don't know, 25 kilograms of fish, you have to stop fishing for the day and you go back to the port, you go home. So here's the question that academics ask. They say, will these fishermen voluntarily, of their own free will, abide by this limit? In other words, will they do so if this agreement does not have the force of law and the government isn't standing by to punish them for violating it? The traditional answer is no, they won't. They won't abide by this agreement. Scholars have often thought that individuals need the presence of a powerful enforcer, someone who would punish violators in order for this agreement to be kept. This is the original justification for Hobbes's Leviathan, the great ruler who stands ready to enforce the law and punish those who would disobey. Only so, these academics have thought, can there be cooperation and order. So why have scholars thought this? Why have they thought that everyone is just self-interested and they won't cooperate unless there's a threat of punishment? Well, scholars have thought this because they assume that people, they won't think cooperatively. They will only think as individuals and they will only think selfishly. And if people think like this, well, of course they won't keep the agreement. So consider the alternatives. Imagine if everyone else is abiding by the agreement. Imagine everybody else is observing the limit. These academics will say, is it in your rational self-interest to abide by the limit? No. I mean, you're catching a few extra fish won't in itself hurt the fishing grounds. After all, you're just one person, but it will mean extra money for you. So it is supposedly rational for you to violate the agreement if everyone else is keeping it. Okay, well, what if everyone else is violating the agreement? What should you do? Should you keep it? No, the fishing ground will be destroyed because everyone's violating the agreement. So you should make as much money as you can while you can. This means that you're supposedly in what's known as a prisoner's dilemma. You're in a situation where no matter what everybody else does, it's supposedly in your interest to violate the agreement. But on the assumption that what is rational for you to do, it's rational for everyone else to do also, this means that it's rational for everybody, it's rational for each of the fishermen to violate the agreement. So everyone is going to pursue the rational strategy of violating the agreement. The fishing grounds will be destroyed and everyone's livelihood will be at an end. So this is taken to be a paradox of rational choice theory. The rational choice produces a terrible, terrible outcome. So we get the following strange result. Everyone doing what is rational gets us down here, where the fishing ground is destroyed and everyone's out of a job, your livelihood is over, it's a terrible situation. Whereas if people had cooperated, which is, note, the irrational thing to do, if everyone had cooperated, that's irrational. If everyone had behaved irrationally, you would have wound up there where the fishing grounds would have been preserved and everyone would have had a lifetime of successful fishing and a healthy fishing ground. This is weird. Honestly, it seems a little weird to me to define rationality such that acting rationally produces the worst possible outcome. That seems honestly like the definition of irrationality, not rationality. Well, what's the problem here? Maybe the problem is that scholars and academics are failing to understand this basic fact about what made humans so successful in the first place, the kind of reasoning that allowed humans to become the dominant species on the planet. Humans often do reason as individuals, but we succeed because we reason cooperatively. We don't only ask what it's rational for me to do, we often ask what it is rational for us to do. The whole prisoner's dilemma arises because each person supposedly asks what it's rational for me to do and acts on that. But if all parties to the prisoner's dilemma ask what it is rational for us to do, the answer is obvious. It's irrational for us to cooperate since cooperation produces the best outcome for everyone. Well, it'll come as no surprise, I think, that experimental results confirm that individuals they tend not to behave as the above narrative would predict. As a group of economists writes, summarizing extensive literature on the prisoner's dilemma conducted in laboratory settings, among the more robust findings to come out of experimental economics is that human players do not behave as game theory predicts. In laboratory prisoners' dilemmas, individual contributions toward the group good can be substantial. In fact, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the time, test subjects choose to cooperate rather than defect. That is, they think in terms of what would benefit the group rather than in terms of what would produce the most benefit to themselves only. They don't just ask, what does it make sense for me to do? They ask, what does it make sense for us to do? And they assume that other players are thinking the same way. Well, frankly, this should not be terribly surprising. After all, as I said, what sets humans apart as animals is that we are cooperative animals. That's the success, the secret to the success of our species. Despite the assumptions and presuppositions of many academics, humans don't only go around reasoning as individuals, we reason together. And if we look at various examples of the tragedy of the commons in the real world, we see that individuals often develop cooperative institutions to solve these problems without the need for some external enforcer. So consider the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on cooperative institutions. So she describes a set of cooperative institutions I'm just going to give you an example. She describes a set of cooperative institutions that arose among fishermen in Alanya, Turkey, to protect the waters that they all relied on. So Ostrom writes that the early 1970s were the dark ages in Alanya. The economic viability of their fishery was threatened by two factors. First, unrestrained use of the fishery had led to hostility and at times violent conflict among the fishers. Second, competition among fishermen for the better fishing spots had increased production costs early in the 1970s. So fishermen were actually fighting each other over the best fishing sites, and the whole place was getting overfished. The fish population was declining. Their whole way of life was threatened. It was just like the prisoner's dilemma, sort of. So what did they do? Early in the 1970s, members of the local cooperative began experimenting with an ingenious system for allotting fishing sites to local fishermen. I'm not going to describe this in great detail because that would be super boring. But there are some key features. For example, a list of local fishermen is prepared at the beginning of the season. All the different fishing locations are mapped out. And in September, there's a lottery that randomly assigns fishermen to fishing locations. So you might be assigned a good location, you might be assigned a bad one. It's just a matter of luck. Hey, but don't worry, you're not stuck with this location for the whole season. From September to January, each day, each fisherman moves east to west. They move to the next location. After January, the fishermen move back west. The system has the effect of spacing the fishermen far apart, but it also gives all fishing boats an equal chance to fish at the best spots. So resources are not wasted searching for or fishing over a site. The list of fishing locations is endorsed by all the fishermen and deposited with the local mayor and the local gendarme. No one wants to cheat in this system because they want to have a good shot at the best fishing spots when it's their day. So they don't want people cheating on this system. And the few infractions that have occurred have been handled easily by the fishermen at the local coffee house. So successful fishing in Alanya, protection of their fishing grounds with a cooperative institution that they built, no need for law enforcement, no need for the Hobbesian Leviathan. So Ostrom offers a bunch of examples of institutions like this, cooperative institutions, from institutions meant to protect fishing grounds to those meant to protect common grazing lands for people grazing their herds. Some have survived for centuries, if you believe that. Some of these cooperative institutions or arrangements have lived for centuries, which is a testament to the stability of well-designed cooperative institutions. Now, an important lesson of her work, and I think this is an important lesson for students such as yourselves, who are learning how to design real-world programs and institutions, is how to design cooperative institutions so that they both protect common resources, but they're also stable and long-lived. Like I said, some of these institutions have survived for centuries. So history has also seen important cooperation, not just on a local scale, but also on an international scale. So one of the great successes of international cooperation was the banning of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. CFCs are chemicals that were long used for cooling. So they were used in air conditioners and refrigerators and things like that. Unfortunately, researchers discovered in the 1970s that CFCs, once they leaked out into the air, they would travel up to the upper atmosphere and destroy the ozone layer. Well, as you remember from high school science class, that's very bad news, right? Because the ozone layer absorbs most of the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Without the ozone layer, the Earth would literally not be habitable. Even moderate damage to the ozone layer would result in many thousands more deaths from skin cancer because people would be constantly bombarded by much more harmful UV radiation from the sun. So the world reacted quickly to this news. In 1985, the world signed on to a convention for the protection of the ozone layer. And only 2 years later, in 1987, they signed the Montreal Protocol, which was an agreement to phase out the production of CFCs. These two conventions were eventually ratified by every country in the world, making them the first treaties in UN history to achieve universal ratification, only 13 years after publication of the first article revealing the connection between CFCs and ozone destruction. The ozone layer is recovering and is projected, it is projected that the ozone layer will return to its 1980 level of health sometime in the next 30 to 50 years. According to a study done by the US Environmental Protection Agency, the Montreal Protocol prevented 280 million cases of skin cancer and 1.5 million skin cancer deaths in the US alone. Imagine how many lives it saved across the world. So a striking example of international cooperation. So I'd say that a couple of things are clear. First, it's clear that humans are able to think cooperatively and build rules and institutions for the common good. So humans don't merely pursue individual projects and goals, but they often pursue cooperative projects aimed at common goals. Second, it's clear that these cooperative rules and institutions can sometimes, maybe under very special circumstances, exist without an external enforcer, without an external police officer, without a Hobbesian Leviathan standing ready to punish violators. So it's not accurate to model all common resource problems as prisoners' dilemmas, where everyone is going to defect without a threat of punishment. People can, and they do, voluntarily cooperate for the preservation of common resources. But we have to recognize, let's be realistic here, that even though humans can cooperate to protect common resources, they often fail to do so. Humans can build voluntary institutions to prevent the tragedy of the commons. We've just discussed a couple of cases where humans have done that. But there are tragically too many cases where humans have failed to construct such institutions, and we see common resources on which we all rely being depleted and threatened with destruction. So the lesson of this is that when it comes to common resources or communal threats, thinking merely as selfish individuals can destroy that resource and make us vulnerable to that threat. Cooperative thinking, on the other hand, can preserve this resource or help us face this threat. Now, this takes us to the challenge of COVID. One area in which we clearly see a clash between individualist thinking and cooperative thinking is in the response of different communities to the current COVID crisis. We've seen some populations respond very cooperatively as collectives concerned for the welfare of the community, and we've seen other populations insist rather on individual rights and prerogatives, privileging those over the ongoing good of the community. So consider, for example, New Zealand's response to the pandemic. Famously, New Zealand's response was enormously successful. A nation of 5 million people, New Zealand had fewer than 2,000 cases and only a couple of dozen deaths. Now, to be sure, the government implemented measures to control the spread of COVID, testing and tracing, implementing a strict lockdown, et cetera, but measures like these are only effective to the extent that people cooperate in the execution of such strategies. So New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, sold such strategies to the public, and notice how she sold these strategies. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern provided empathetic leadership and effectively communicated key messages to the public, framing combating the pandemic as the work of a unified team of 5 million, which resulted in high public confidence and adherence to a suite of relatively burdensome pandemic control measures. So New Zealanders saw themselves as cooperating. They saw themselves as a team cooperating toward a common goal, controlling the spread of the pandemic, and hence they were willing to adopt measures that contributed to this common goal. Cooperative thinking leads to solutions for common problems. Yay, success for cooperative thinking. But what happens if people don't see themselves as cooperating toward a common goal? What if people see themselves rather as individuals whose primary prerogative is to pursue their individual goals and ignore pleas to cooperate in the promotion of the common good or some cooperative project or goal? To answer this question, we only need to look at my own country, the United States. It's often commented that the United States has a much more individualistic ethos as distinguished from the more communitarian mindset possessed by some other countries which more strongly embrace measures for the promotion of the common good, such as government-provided healthcare, free university education, and other kinds of social benefits. Dr. Jared Baton, who's an epidemiologist at the University of Washington, he recently told the New York Times, "As an American, I think there's a lot of good to be said about our libertarian tradition, but this is the consequence. We don't succeed as well as a collective." So no surprise then that America has been impacted so much more severely than countries like New Zealand. In fact, there was recently an art installation on the mall, the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where the artist installed flags to represent people who died from the COVID pandemic. And so this is in front of it. You see this little square of flags over here on the right represents how many people died in New Zealand from COVID. This square on the left represents how many people in the US would have died had the death rate in the US been proportional to that of New Zealand. So if the US had been as successful as New Zealand in combating COVID, that little box on the left, that's how many Americans would have died. How many Americans actually died? That many. So America's individualistic approach did not bear fruit, unless death is fruit, I guess. So this failure to approach the problem cooperatively as a collective can be seen in people's thinking for example, mask mandates, the requirement to wear a mask. The US has a relatively lower rate of mask wearing than a lot of other countries. According to the New York Times, throughout much of the Northeast and the West Coast, more than 80% of people wore masks when within 6 feet of someone else. In more conservative areas, like the Southeast, the share was closer to 50%. Why has the US done so badly at this basic pandemic control measure? Well, the Brookings Institute, they did a poll of Americans. They went on and asked Americans who don't wear masks, why they don't wear masks. 40% replied, "It's my right as an American not to wear a mask." A further 24% replied, "It's uncomfortable." So fully 64% appealed either to individual rights or to their personal comfort to justify not undertaking a simple measure to promote the common good. Little wonder then that although the US has 4% of the world's population, it accounts for 22% of global coronavirus deaths. Now, more successful nations have succeeded either because they have taken a cooperative approach, like New Zealand, or because they've taken a frankly authoritarian approach. So these should not be conflated with each other because they're not the same thing. So for example, one reason China was so successful in controlling the pandemic was because the state has a more, you might say, authoritarian structure. It was more able than a lot of other countries to implement strict surveillance and social controls. So Gregory Poland, who's at the Mayo Clinic, he praised China's response in The Lancet. He had a lot of positive things to say about China's response. He said, in China, you have a combination of a population that takes respiratory infections seriously and is willing to adopt non-pharmaceutical interventions, with a government that can put bigger constraints on individual freedoms than would be considered acceptable in most Western countries. Commitment to the greater good is ingrained in the culture. There is not the hyper-individualism that characterizes parts of the USA and has driven most of the resistance to the countermeasures against the coronavirus. Liberal states, I think, should be reluctant to adopt such measures, but other states have been successful in combating the pandemic through cooperation, not through authoritarianism. For example, the rate of COVID infection in the US is nearly 5 times what it is in Canada. You can actually see on this chart, the smaller bars at the bottom are the COVID rates in Canada per 100,000. Whereas the taller bars are the rates per 100,000 in the United States. You can see a much higher infection rate. Now, to be sure, Canada has some natural advantages such as lower population density, but also the Washington Post reports, Canadians were just more cooperative and disciplined. So the Post reports, the Canadian people have been less divided and more disciplined. Some provinces and territories could have locked down sooner, analysts say, but once measures were announced, they were strict, broadly uniform, and widely followed. The cooperative approach has even extended to Canada's politicians. Imagine that, politicians cooperating. Analysts, Canadian officials have largely set aside partisan grievances for a Team Canada effort. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney sent excess personal protective gear to provinces in need, including Quebec, led by frequent sparring partner Premier François Legault. This contrasts with the response in the United States, where President Trump has at times seemed to condition federal aid on support for him, and governors have fought with each other over, and with the federal government over critical supplies. So Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, all of these countries have enjoyed large-scale cooperation by their citizens with anti-pandemic measures and have been rewarded with relatively low infection and mortality rates. So a pandemic is a problem that faces communities as a whole, not just individuals, and as such requires a communal, cooperative response. Communities that fail to respond as such, where individuals think of themselves primarily as individuals and refuse to engage in community-based problem solving, they will suffer the consequences, as we have seen. Now, one thing I think is abundantly clear. As we enter what we are hopefully entering, the post-COVID era, humanity faces a number of problems that can only be solved by cooperation. Humanity faces, for example, an existential threat in the form of global climate catastrophe. Individualistic thinking can no more address the problem of climate change than it could address the challenge of COVID. Now, the signs of this catastrophe are all around us. Research done by the World Wildlife Fund shows that vertebrate populations have declined by over 60% since 1970. That's a reduction in the worldwide population of vertebrates of over half in the past 50 years. It's likely that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction that the planet Earth has ever seen. The Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions over its lifetime. The most famous one, which killed the dinosaurs, was most likely caused by an asteroid impact. The other 4, actually, were caused by abrupt climate change, often itself the result of cataclysmic volcanic activity or something else, which dumped massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. We're currently doing exactly that artificially, dumping lots of carbon in the atmosphere. We are crafting our own extinction. We are creating the apocalypse. In this post-COVID world, we face problems that can only be solved if we recognize that these problems are problems that we face together, collectively, and to which we formulate collective solutions. We can't think individually. We have to think cooperatively. And as we've seen in response to the COVID pandemic, there are 2 main ways of getting people to work together to solve a common problem. One of these ways of getting people to work together is through authoritarianism. You implement an extensive surveillance state, you massively limit people's freedoms, and you generate compliance through overwhelming coercion. Now, I don't think that this way of solving collective problems is realistic in most of the world, nor do I think it's desirable. From the Arab Spring to the Umbrella Revolution, we're seeing that humans all over the world are utilizing the language of rights to assert that they cannot and will not be sacrificed by the state, that they are entitled to individual liberties, and that while they may be part of a collective, they are also individuals with dignity, deserving of the liberties and privileges appropriate to such a status. Our modern conception of rights is actually one of the most important innovations that we've come up with as humans. The whole point of rights is to prevent individuals from being sacrificed for the good of the collective. So as modern states gain more power, and modern states have become very, very powerful, as they gain more ability to collect information on their citizens, the notion of rights is more important than ever. So authoritarianism, maybe not the best way of solving these problems. So the other way of getting people to work together to solve common problems is by following the path of countries like New Zealand and South Korea, by getting people to see themselves as part of a team, working together toward a common goal. So one achieves cooperation by instilling in people a communitarian ethic, an ethic where we see ourselves as part of a community, bound together in concern for the common good. Unfortunately, what a lot of people fail to see is that concern for the community, willing cooperation for the benefit of the community, is actually compatible with a robust conception of rights. Indeed, it's actually not really clear how you could have rights outside of a community which could nurture and protect those rights. You should cooperate to protect your community. And so when we see videos of people insisting on not wearing masks and appealing to their rights, I think we should just regard them as confused. Confused because they think that possession of rights means that they can't or shouldn't cooperate with others for the good of everyone. So this, I think, is the challenge for a post-COVID ethics. We can't go back to a time before the widespread recognition of human rights. We can't, and we shouldn't. Nor can we sink into some foolish individualism which only cares about rights but refuses to cooperate for the common good. An ethics for the modern era has to insist on both. It recognizes that while the individual cannot be sacrificed for the common good, we are nevertheless social and cooperative beings. And tackling the problems that we face requires our willing cooperation. We need an ethics that respects both the individual and the community, which elevates both rights and cooperation. Only by reconciling these two essential features of ethics can we, as a species, survive the significant challenges that we face as we continue into the 21st century. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Koons. This is
wonderful,
absolutely stunning. It's just that as a presentation, of course, it was amazing, but in terms of the way it contributed to Design Post-COVID Humanity, the 3T program, it was really mesmerizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, in the remaining time, we would like to open the floor for Q&A. And I haven't checked the chat box, but Mr. Göksal, do you want to?
I guess Wamui has a question. Maybe you can ask directly here, Wamui, or I can.
Yeah, if you want, please, because
okay.
We are like, let's try to get as many questions as possible. Yeah.
Okay, and the question is, what can the USA do to improve the COVID measures? Kindly ask to your dear Koons.
You know, that's actually a hard question because, well, so I think the problem is that this idea of rights is so ingrained in the U.S. that attempts to enforce mask mandates and things like that are actually met with threats of violence. And you know, many police forces have said that they won't enforce mask mandates. You know, the U.S. population is and the people who most rigorously oppose these mask mandates are often armed. So there's actually a real threat in trying to enforce this mask mandate. So I'm actually very pessimistic. I don't think that the U.S. can or will do anything to improve it. I think the only hope is a vaccine. But frankly, I'm not even sure, because of the amount of disinformation out there. I'm not even sure that the U.S. is going to achieve herd immunity. You know, one of the things that undermines cooperation is lack of a shared factual reality. You know, there was a time when people would have disagreements, but at least we lived in the same world, right? And more these days, people don't live in the same world. We don't live in the same factual reality. And if you don't live in the same factual reality, you're not starting from the same basis for cooperation. One of the most interesting things, and I encourage everyone to go watch this, is this little mini documentary called The Social Dilemma, where they interview a bunch of former executives and designers with the tech companies about how the algorithms that social media companies use to draw your attention, you know, if you watch this, then you're probably interested in this. And if you watch this, you're probably interested in this. How this drives people to see only things that they agree with. And so this is what drives people into these, what they call echo chambers. So all you're ever exposed to are things that you agree with. And so this ends up driving, like people in the US, this ends up driving people on the left into these things where they don't possibly see how anyone could have a conservative point of view. And it drives people on the right down these weird conspiracy theory rabbit holes like QAnon and stuff like that. And so you end up with this radically bifurcated society where, like I said, they don't even live in the same world. How can you get people to cooperate if they literally don't inhabit the same factual reality? I think it's a problem that actually threatens the fabric of society. You can't underestimate how serious this problem is right now.
Thank you so much, dear doctor. And another question from Ayan, and let me share, or you can ask directly, dear Ayan.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Jeremy, for an informative lecture. What I wanted to understand is, I understand that it's hard to kind of give tips in terms of that would actually work, but from your experience and the different ways you might have worked with other people and encouraged cooperation, what are some universal tips that we can all apply, whatever country we're in, that we can apply to our projects and so forth, that has worked for you in encouraging cooperation?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I would said, you know, I mean, there are a variety of things, and I would actually recommend, because everyone has so much free time on their hands these days. So Eleanor Ostrom, so the book that I really strongly recommend is actually this book called Governing the Commons by Eleanor Ostrom, because this is the book where she actually examines a lot of these different commons institutions, where whether it's, you know, like I said, this group of fishermen protecting these common fishing grounds in Turkey, or there's, you know, or she has a case study where she talks about this common area, this region in Switzerland where they all graze their cattle on this common ground, and they've had this institution for hundreds of years to protect it. And there are a variety of things that I mean, there's some sort of general things. You know, one thing is that, and a lot of it is kind of common sense, right? Like it has to be, your institution has to be set up such that it's easy to detect people who defect from the agreement, right? And so if you look at the fishermen in Alanya, Turkey, you know if someone has stolen your spot because they're there, right? The fishermen themselves are the people who observe violators, right? So, you know, there's some common sense things like that are the kinds of things that can sustain these cooperative institutions over time. And none of them are super complicated. And like I said, people have figured out a lot of these different mechanisms. But it's, you know, it's going to be sort of simple things like that. Like, you know, can people violate in secret, or is there a mechanism for figuring them out? Who's gonna watch people? Can the system itself be maintained in that way?
Thank you so much, dear Dr. Koons. And the next question coming from dear Enu. Enu, you can ask directly.
Okay, thank you very much Doctor, for your presentation. It's really spot on, especially in the period which we are. But I think my question was, he answered my question just at the time I was typing it. So
okay.
so it was about social media polarization. So, but I think his explanation was really, really explicit. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Next question.
Question from Esnaira. Esnaira, if you're ready, you can ask directly.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is more on your assessment on the international cooperation. How would you assess the nation state that we have now, given that we have lots of problems that we are facing, not just the corona, but as you've said, we have the climate change that we're facing, and it can lead to human extinction, for example. So how would you assess the international cooperation? What's been done? What's been working? Um, and in our educational institutions, how can we promote more cooperations, given that I feel like my personal observation is a lot of people are very much individualistic, and they're very pursuing their individual interests. So how can we actually promote people to cooperate, knowing that, as you've said, um, it is in our survival that we cooperate? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that you know, in a way, I think this gets back to the idea of that was mentioned earlier of polarization and lack of a shared factual reality. You know, there have always been groups who have sort of a vested interest in muddying the factual waters. You know, tobacco companies for a long time had departments that specifically worked to kind of cloud the public debate on whether smoking was bad for your health or caused cancer. I mean, they deliberately muddied the waters on that and made it and tried to slow the public debate on that. And you've had groups who've done the similar thing for climate change. And again, you know, like I said, if there's not an agreement on factual reality, then it's hard to get people to act in a cooperative manner. We didn't have this problem so much back in the 70s and 80s when the world acted so quickly to solve the problem of the ozone layer. We all agreed what the problem was. We knew what the problem was. There wasn't ozone hole skepticism, right? The way there's climate change skepticism. And so, you know, I think that really what the world is suffering from nowadays is just another example of superpower politics, where, you know, some of the most powerful nations don't see how it's in their interest to mitigate climate change, which is odd because it so obviously is, right? You know, the Pentagon, the U.S. Pentagon does a threat analysis periodically, and the U.S. Pentagon routinely lists climate change as one of the top security threats to the United States because of wars over resources, because of increased refugee problems that it's going to cause. And so I think people who know what they're talking about recognize that as many resources as it has, the United States is not immune to this. But because of the kinds of things I was talking about earlier, the way in which disinformation is spread, it's paralyzed some of these powerful countries and kept them from acting in a way that's cooperative. So really, I think at the end of the day, I think one of our fundamental problems in humanity is an epistemological problem. Really, it's a problem of not having a shared basis of knowledge that we can use to act cooperatively. Like I said, you know, I think the example of the ozone layer is such a great example of we found a problem, we agreed what the problem was, we solved the problem. Why can't climate change be like that? Because the shared knowledge that we used to be able to take for granted is just it's been destroyed by our current media climate. That's a pessimistic answer.
I think it was the last question, Dr. Talk. And
yes, last question.
Thank you, Dr. Koons, your great explanation and presentation. And I believe that we got so many inspiration and keys to make post-COVID humanity as inclusive, as cooperative. And thank you so much for your cooperation. No. Back to you, Dr. Talk.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you once again, Professor Koons, for being with us. Dear colleagues, without any break, right actually into our next talk by Professor Nader Hashemi. He's not a stranger to you. You know that he was presenting last month, and today he'll be presenting one of his recent publications. And just a kind refresher, Professor Hashemi is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and assistant and professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And welcome back, Professor Hashemi.
Welcome again, Dr. Hashemi.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everyone again. Good morning and assalamu alaikum from Denver, Colorado, where there's a lot of snow on the ground and a lot of cold wind in the air. I'm sorry that we can't be together. This is my second presentation to your group. I'm very excited to be part of this project. Last time I spoke about, the coronavirus pandemic and its relationship to various political regimes. Today, I'm going to be speaking about a topic that is much more connected to the contemporary politics of the Arab and Islamic world. But I just want everyone to know that my next presentation will be based on a book that I want all of you to start reading if you haven't started already. It's a book that's perfectly connected to this project of a post-pandemic humanity, and it's Fareed Zakaria's recently published book called 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. I think it's a great book that perfectly fits in with this project. There's a lot of really good ideas. Not all of the ideas you have to agree with, but it really, I think, stimulates a lot of thinking about, where we are in the world and how young people can make a contribution to the world, after this crisis is over. So as you all know, the focus of everyone's attention now is on the pandemic. It's on the vaccine. Today in the United States, the first distribution of the vaccine is beginning. Hopefully, inshallah, by next summer, the worst will be behind us and we can start thinking about the lessons to be learned from this particular crisis. But as we're all focused on the pandemic and the rising death toll and the arrival of the vaccine, politics and life is continuing and decisions are taking place. Diplomatic deals and conversations are happening behind closed doors by powerful players that are shaping the politics of the Middle East and the broader Arab Islamic world. And that's precisely what I want to speak to you today. I want to speak to you today about a topic that you are all familiar with, that you are all aware of, and that is, of course, the recent series of agreements between Israel and a series of Arab states known as the Abraham Accords. And I'd like to begin by first launching my PowerPoint slide, which I hope you can all see. And so I want to speak about this particular topic, and I want to provide a critical perspective on this topic. And then I want to hear from you and have a conversation with you about this particular subject. So last August, it was announced that Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and later Bahrain, and more recently Sudan and Morocco, were normalizing relations with Israel. And this announcement was celebrated across the American political spectrum as a historic breakthrough and an important contribution to peace in the Middle East. Despite their big differences on politics, this is one subject that Joe Biden and Donald Trump were in full agreement on. In fact, Joe Biden issued a statement celebrating the announcement of this diplomatic deal known as the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And in fact, he tried to own and take responsibility for this success. In fact, he explicitly said in his statement, the coming together of Israel and the Arab states builds on the efforts of multiple administrations to foster a broader Arab-Israeli opening. In other words, he was saying that, look, the Obama-Biden administration worked hard to achieve this goal, so we should be credited with this achievement. Now, the news of this announcement was met in the mainstream American press, but also in Western capitals, with a lot of celebration and euphoria. In the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, the prominent and controversial, in my view, discredited foreign policy analyst, wrote that this agreement hit him like a breath of fresh air. He agreed with the White House that this was a huge breakthrough for regional peace and stability. David Ignatius, who writes for the Washington Post, a very prominent foreign policy and influential foreign policy voice here in the United States, agreed with this assessment. He wrote, "Finally, the dominoes are falling in the Middle East in the right direction for a change, and this is a building block for a better future." The European press, I suspect, had similar positive interpretations of this news story. I didn't look at the European press closely, but this is how this event has been portrayed broadly in the West. The truth, of course, is quite different, as a moments of reflection will reveal. What possible good could come from a secret agreement between a racist American president, his corrupt son-in-law, a neo-fascist Israeli prime minister, and several Arab dictators? Adding to this list, there is the figure of the notorious Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who reportedly played a key role as a consultant, advisor, and co-architect of this deal. On this measure alone, the Abraham Accords, as they are officially known, should have been met with deep skepticism. The fact that it was not met with skepticism tells us something profoundly important about the ideological bias and the deep, erroneous, and misguided assumptions within the mainstream American foreign policy understanding of the Middle East. This agreement also tells us something important about the new challenges and obstacles facing democracy in the Middle East. The only value of this agreement between the Emirates and Israel lies in its ability to teach us something. The celebration of this deal in the West is one of those rare clarifying moments. It exposes what has long been wrong with US and Western foreign policy toward the Middle East, specifically its deep dependence on authoritarian and repressive regimes, while ignoring the core aspirations of the region's peoples for political freedom, accountable government, and self-determination. Given its weak foundations, the likely consequences of this diplomatic deal is that over the long term, it will undermine political stability in the region while further impugning, while further discrediting in the eyes of the people of the Arab Islamic world, the reputation of its key signatories, Israel, Arab autocratic regimes, and the United States of America. Now, how can we explain these developments? Disappointment among several Arab states with US Middle East policy is a factor in bringing together various Arab states with Israel. For a long time, these states have been privately urging Washington, D.C. to, quote, cut off the head of the Iranian snake, in the words of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, revealed through a leaked WikiLeaks cable. For a moment, it seemed that the Trump administration had finally heeded their call. Donald Trump was imposing crippling sanctions on Tehran, and talk of regime change among Donald Trump's foreign policy advisors flooded the airwaves. On 3 occasions, twice in the middle of 2019 and once in early 2020, an American military strike against Iran seemed imminent. Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed waited for these strikes with bated breath and with lots of anticipation. When these military strikes did not take place, these leaders were deeply shocked and confused. The timing of the UAE-Israel Accord is very much connected to the perceived security implications of these events. The signing of this agreement has been enhanced by the possibility, looking at the world from the summer of 2020 when the agreement was signed, that Donald Trump might not get elected, which actually happened. But also the fact that Joe Biden has stated that he wants to re-engage with Iran, start a dialogue, and return the United States to the Iran nuclear agreement. Joe Biden has also publicly stated that he wants to be more critical of the policies, both internally and regionally, of several Arab states, primarily Saudi Arabia. And so allying with Israel, the decision by these Arab states to ally themselves with Israel at this particular moment makes sense in this particular context. Now, the real threats, and so the way that you hear the interpretation of this event is that the reason why Israel and these Arab states have gotten together is because they fear Iran's regional role, its intervention in Iraq and Syria, et cetera, its threats that it poses to countries in the region. And that undoubtedly is very true, but there's something else that's going on, what I call a much more urgent threat that brings Israel and these Arab states together, and that is fear of regional democratization. This was on display 10 years ago in the 2011 Arab Spring. The Emirates and Israel strongly opposed the Arab revolutions, and they celebrated the 2013 military coup in Egypt. Reportedly, Benjamin Netanyahu was repeatedly on the phone with President Obama saying, "Do not abandon Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Stick with him." And the United Arab Emirates also played a very critical role in subverting Egypt's post-Mubarak transition. This has been widely documented, and after the coup in Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates bankrolled the Egyptian military and continue to finance that regime. So the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, has long viewed an emancipated civil society in the Arab world as a fundamental threat to its national security. Any victory for pluralistic civilian rule in the region would be a defeat for the United Arab Emirates model of military rule. It is for this reason that Abu Dhabi's strategic narrative of authoritarian stability was built on the premise that socio-political pluralism in the Arab world would allegedly lead to chaos under civilian rule. In private conversations with Western diplomats, the Emirates has repeatedly made this argument, which sounds very persuasive and convincing to liberal ears in the West, in part because it confirms long-standing prejudices about Islam, Muslims, and democracy. According to a leaked WikiLeaks cable, Mohammed bin Zayed told the American ambassador that, quote, "greater democracy in the region will in the short term empower the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Hezbollah." This is the official Arab autocratic regime narrative. And for a long time, it has found receptive ears in Western capitals and among Western liberal intellectuals. This argument, however, is deeply flawed and self-defeating. Fact: torture states in the Middle East do not produce Jeffersonian Democrats, but rather extremists, which is the desired result that Western-backed military regimes in the Arab world prefer. The support that they derive from Western governments is predicated precisely on fighting the threat that their policies consciously produce. The real fear that motivates Arab authoritarian regimes is not the rise of militant versions of political Islam, but the potential of democracy that includes religious-based parties that accept the rules of democratic politics. This is clearly visible in Tunisia today, the one Arab country to undergo a democratic transition during the Arab Spring, where Ennahda has played a foundational and important role both in the transition to democracy and in the consolidation of democracy. How has the United Arab Emirates responded to events in Tunisia? It has backed political parties that seek a return to dictatorship and authoritarianism, thus proving the UAE argument a complete lie about the threat of radical political Islam. Another factor that brings the Emirates and Bahrain and Israel together is opposition to Palestinian nationalism. In the case of Israel, the reason for this is straightforward. Crushing Palestinian aspirations for self-determination makes Israel's conquest of the West Bank much easier. In the case of the UAE and other Arab authoritarian regimes, Palestinian nationalism is a deep irritant. It's a troubling development because it stirs up revolutionary sentiment in the Islamic world. it generates popular anger, and it produces political mobilization against the regional status quo and the regimes that seek to maintain it. Now, the Abraham Accords that were recently signed have produced a huge moment of celebration in Israel and among Israel's supporters in the West. Israel has scored a major political, diplomatic, and strategic victory. And I think we have to be completely honest about this. This is a major moment of triumph for Israel. Israel has never been stronger, while the Palestinians have never been weaker. Several Arab states have now abandoned previous conditions that they put in place for peace with Israel, and they have effectively accepted the terms for peace outlined by the Likud party in Israel. Moreover, more Arab states are now rumored to be contemplating this move. Recently on Friday, Morocco made an announcement. There's talk of Oman, and of course, Saudi Arabia is the big prize. Furthermore, Israel's sense of euphoria and triumph and accomplishment has been bolstered by the fact that the Palestinians today are openly mocked on prominent Arab television programs by senior members of the Saudi royal family, reflecting this changing Arab state attitude toward the Israel-Palestine conflict. So while this is an outright victory for Israel, in my view, it is a fake victory and a short-term victory at best. Israel has made a Faustian bargain, a bargain with the devil, with autocratic Arab regimes that is rooted in two false assumptions. One, that Palestinian nationalism has been permanently crushed, and two, that the people of the Arab Islamic world will be content forever with living as second-class citizens under repressive governments that deny them dignity and democracy. In most of the mainstream Western commentary on the Abraham Accords, this topic has been pointedly ignored. Specifically, there has been very little discussion or recognition that Israel's new allies in the Arab world suffer from expanding crises of legitimacy, governing restless populations with poor economic prospects. How long can these regimes last? And what will Israel and the West do when these regimes start to crumble? This is not a hypothetical question. Israel, in fact, faced this national security dilemma before. Moshe Aarons, the former Israeli foreign minister and 3 times minister of defense from the Likud party, reflected on this topic with considerable candor and clarity at the start of the 2011 Arab Spring revolts. He contemplated the viability of an Israeli national security doctrine predicated on peace with dictators. And he wrote, quote, "The ugly facts are that the 2 peace treaties that Israel concluded so far, one with Egypt and the other with Jordan, were both signed with dictators, Anwar Sadat and King Hussein. The question that Israelis ask themselves at this moment is, if Hosni Mubarak's regime were to be replaced by a democratically elected government in Egypt, would this government continue to maintain the 32-year-old peace treaty with Israel?" Now, Moshe Aarons came close to admitting what scholars of the Israel-Palestine conflict have known for a very long time. Israel's security in the Middle East, over the long term, can only be guaranteed by making peace with the people of the region, not with the dictators that rule over them. This can only happen if Israel is willing to give some justice to the Palestinians, which is a precondition for its acceptance as a legitimate state in the eyes of the people of the Arab Islamic world. Thus, far from enhancing the prospects for peace in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, the deal that was struck between Israel and these Arab states, will likely have the opposite effect. Viewed from the perspective of the peoples of the Middle East, not the authoritarian regimes that dominate them, Israel's reputation has been further impugned by recent developments. Beyond the general perception in the Arab Islamic world that Israel is a settler colonial state that has displaced and continues to subjugate Palestinians, Israel's reputation has suffered a second blow. Today, Israel is widely viewed as a key regional backer of despotic regimes that oppose democratization, reject political change, and block the advancement of citizens' rights. The future of the Middle East looks very bleak. all of the key social, political, and economic indicators suggest that this region is coming and is headed toward an explosion, a convulsion. The current authoritarian order is unsustainable, given the volatile mix of repressive states with youthful populations and very dim economic prospects. When the next Arab uprising for dignity and democracy takes place, I predict it will be much angrier, more violent than the one that preceded it 10 years ago. And a key target of this anger will be leaders of the axis of Arab autocracies, but also their Israeli ally, an ally that is today proudly and openly helping to sustain their autocratic rule. So let me now get to a conclusion as quickly as possible. What does all of this mean for the struggle for democracy and political change in the Middle East? I think several points are worth noting here. Two issues that previously were separate in terms of their origins, the Israel-Palestine conflict and the struggle for democracy in the Middle East, have now become deeply fused, deeply interconnected and integrated. This marks a clear departure from the past and a clear turning point in the politics of the region. Israel and the authoritarian Arab regime alliance stand opposed to regional democratization for reasons that I've already mentioned. Both parts of this alliance have much to lose if democracy in the Middle East is to be advanced. The Arab ruling elites will lose their power and privileges, and Israel's ability to subjugate the Palestinians and to continue its occupation will be weakened, especially if democratic governments come to power in the Arab world who demand land concessions from Israel in exchange for recognition. Now, also, I think it needs to be pointed out that Western governments here are deeply complicit in this arrangement. Recall the euphoric celebration in the United States among both Democrats and Republicans, but also in leading Western capitals this summer when it was announced that the Abraham Accords were being signed between Israel and a series of Arab states. Now, Western governments will make the argument that beyond their long-standing older belief in authoritarian stability in the Middle East, now they have an argument that Arab authoritarian regimes must be supported and democracy must be rejected because these Arab authoritarian regimes uphold peace agreements with Israel. Now, we were sort of reminded of this exactly 1 week ago when France rolled out the red carpet and hosted the notorious dictator of Egypt, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, in Paris. Not only was General el-Sisi hosted by President Emmanuel Macron, but he was actually awarded the Legion of Honor, the highest order of merit for military and civilian accomplishment that France gives to individuals for their contribution to politics and government. To my knowledge, not one Western liberal democracy condemned this outrageous act by France, thus tacitly approving of the policies and the politics of the Egyptian dictator. And this is very much, unfortunately, the view in many Western capitals today, that our best allies and our best friends are not democratic forces in civil society in the Arab and Islamic world, but these dictators that protect our interests. And now they're performing another important service for us. They're establishing relations with Israel. So as we end the year 2020, this is what the political landscape in the Middle East looks like. On the plus side, perhaps these new deep linkages that now exist between the axis of Arab autocracies in Israel and the question of the Israel-Palestine conflict might produce political changes in the following sense. If there's ever a democratic revolution or a democratic transition in the Arab world, this will have consequences that might assist the Palestinians in gaining their national and political rights. So for example, if there's a political transition in Jordan or in Egypt or in Morocco, one of the things that people who will now have a voice will demand of their government is some justice for the Palestinians if the relationship with Israel is to be maintained, or if a country doesn't have existing relations with Israel and Israel wants to establish relations with that country at the urging and backing of the West, then democratic governments in the Arab world can say, wait a second, if you want us to recognize Israel, well, Israel has to sort of give some concessions to the Palestinians. Enough is enough. So this might open doors down the road that might help solve the Israel-Palestine conflict in some just way, although this is far from certain and nothing is guaranteed. Let me just sort of end with a few comments on Sudan and Morocco, because I think the reasons why Sudan and Morocco have decided to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, which is another way of saying abandoning the Palestinians. So the reasons why Sudan and Morocco have decided to establish relations with Israel and abandon the Palestinians are somewhat different than the reasons that I identified in my presentation that pertain to the Emirates and Bahrain. With respect to Sudan, if you know anything about the country, is a deeply broken, deeply poor and fragile country that's on the verge of collapse. It's badly straining under crushing economic crises and now the coronavirus pandemic. The decision by Sudan to recognize Israel was driven by these burgeoning economic crises, long lines for fuel and other essential supplies, as well as soaring inflation, threats of protest. Today, it was announced that the United States is removing Sudan from the US terrorism list. And so basically what happened is that at the request of Israel and on Israel's behalf, Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo go to Khartoum and they say, look, if you want to have food again, if you want to be able to survive as a country, if you want to be part of the international community, if you want to get foreign aid, we can remove your name from the US terrorism list. We can help you get out of this crisis that is breaking your country. In exchange, you have to recognize Israel. And that's effectively what the deal was. And of course, the people who made the decision in Sudan were not the people of Sudan, but it's this new transitional government that currently is controlled by the Saudi and UAE-backed military in Sudan. They're the ones who made that decision. Whether the people of Sudan in the coming years, when the transition to democracy is supposed to move forward, whether they will sustain and support that decision remains to be seen. And a similar situation happened with Morocco just recently. Trump basically goes to the King of Morocco, who is in charge of all foreign policy decisions, and he attempted to bribe him. And the bribe actually worked. So he goes to the King of Morocco and he says, look, what do you want in exchange for recognition of Israel? And the king basically says, look, what we fundamentally want is control over the Western Sahara. Now, if you know anything about the Western Sahara, it's this region sort of just below Morocco that borders Mauritania. It has a small border with Algeria, and it's been an area of dispute. Under international law, the Western Sahara is considered to be a non-self-governing authority whose future status is to be determined by the people of Western Sahara through a referendum and through the principles of international law. And so this is a big source of controversy, a longstanding controversy in the history of Morocco. Morocco has sought to dominate the Western Sahara. So in exchange for recognizing Israel, the United States tells Morocco that, look, if you sign an agreement with Israel, we as the United States will recognize Moroccan claims of sovereignty over the Western Sahara. And of course, this is in deep violation of international law. International law does not recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. So this is what Morocco was getting. Morocco was also getting $1 billion in American aid. And when I heard this, I was absolutely shocked. First of all, why does Morocco need $1 billion in military aid? Secondly, where is Morocco, a very poor country, getting $1 billion? I suspect from the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And then thirdly, if Morocco really had $1 billion at its disposal, couldn't that money be better spent in the country for the people of Morocco. So this is basically how these things work. And I suspect between now and January 20th, when Donald Trump is about to leave the White House, there might be an announcement that a couple of other countries are going to do exactly what these other Arab countries have done, effectively abandon the Palestinians and sign a peace treaty with Israel in exchange for these types of security and economic benefits that the United States is promising them. There's a lot more to say on this topic, but I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Oh yeah, one last slide before I end. This is the most recent survey from the Arab Public Opinion Index that surveyed public opinion in the Arab world. And this is the question that was asked. And this is a very respectable and broad-based public opinion. The question was asked, do you support or oppose diplomatic recognition of Israel? Look at where Morocco is. Morocco is right here. 4% of the people of Morocco support recognizing Israel, 88% oppose. In the case of Sudan, the numbers are similar. 13% support recognition of Israel in Sudan, 79% oppose. But of course, this is the fundamental issue that we're talking about. The people of Morocco, the people of Sudan, the people of the Arab Islamic world really don't have a voice in the policies of their governments. And that's precisely the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hashemi. This was really fantastic. Actually, both Mr. Göksel and myself, we were like also looking into the chat box, and I see that there's quite a dynamism there. So for the participants who wish to ask or raise a question, please keep it brief because there's many of them. I understand it's better to kind of provide each of you a chance to share. So please precisely, okay?
I think our first question coming from Zaid, if you want to directly ask.
Do you say Zaid? Oh, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Nader. That was very informative. I really loved your presentation. My question, I'll try to keep it brief, but COVID has obviously magnified the ineptness and failures of in every constitution, especially in the economic institutions across the Middle East. Can we confidently predict another wave of uprisings in the upcoming year as more failures are uncovered in these regimes?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And the reality is we can't predict when these uprisings will take place, but I think it's safe to say that more uprisings and protests are going to take place, particularly after the coronavirus starts to recede and people can gather again without fear of getting infected. Because the underlying socioeconomic grievances, the problem of unemployment, the problem of a lack of a voice, the problem of repressive states, the problem of so many crises, including, we often don't talk about this, but all countries in the Arab and Islamic world are suffering from expanding environmental crises. These have never been addressed. They're leading to a lot of problems that have indirect effects on politics. So, the region is very different than it's been portrayed by Donald Trump and by supporters of the Abraham Accords. They're saying, oh, this is a historic breakthrough, a wonderful transformative moment. The region is, moving forward in a great direction. Well, the reality is very different. So I would argue that, yes, protests, uprisings are going to continue. We just don't know when they'll happen. And that's something that's sort of a fundamental truth about all revolutions. We don't know the exact moment when a revolution will take place, but all of the preconditions for protests and for demands for political change are there. And so I say those things are inevitable.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Dear Fatima, we can continue with you if you want.
Yes, thank you, Göksel. Thank you, Dr. Nader, for your presentation. I really respect your analysis of all of that. I have, first of all, a comment. I would like to say that rapidly. I believe that Israel advocates dictatorship, as from what we see from their aggressive raids on the unarmed Palestinians, and Israel has been using hard power that led to the increase of the votes against the normalizing. My question is, in your opinion and your anticipation, do you believe that the peace treaty would stop the raids of Israel military on Gaza or not? Thank you so much.
No, it will have the exact opposite effect, because now Israel has no constraints to stop it from oppressing the Palestinians. Before, if you know the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, there was always this concern that if Israel acted too aggressively toward the Palestinians, there would be, number one, international condemnation, but also the neighboring Arab states, would put pressure on Israel or its Western allies to try and constrain Israel. And so there's a long history of this. If you know the history, in 1973, so the Arab states, in response to the plight of the Palestinians, issued a global boycott on oil sales to the West because of what was happening to the Palestinians. So right now, Israel, as I said in my talk, is feeling incredibly euphoric, incredibly emboldened and strong. It can do whatever it wants. And in fact, not only can it do whatever it wants to the Palestinians, it can oppress the Palestinians now with open support from several Arab states. So just let me cite one aspect of what is happening right now as we speak between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It was announced that one of the agreements that is taking place, one of the areas of cooperation between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, is over the development of new technology to make security checkpoints in the West Bank much more sophisticated and much more updated. Israel will have the technology, the United Arab Emirates will supply the money to basically better police and cage in the Palestinians in the West Bank. This is the consequences of this accord that is taking place. So in fact, the trend and the expectation is the exact opposite of what you suggested. I think Israel is going to move forward and oppress the Palestinians much more ruthlessly because the constraints and the criticism that previously existed within the region and within Western capitals have been rolled back. So this is another reason for deep despair and deep cause for concern. And on a related note, I'm hoping this particular transformative moment, this particular crisis, which really, targets the Palestinians. I think this is fundamentally the aim of these Abraham Accords. It's basically to advance Israeli occupation of the West Bank. But given what's happened, and given now that the Palestinians, as I said, are openly mocked by the Saudi royal family on Arab television stations, this is a moment, a wake-up call for the Palestine national leadership to sort of reevaluate and move in a different direction. The old policies under Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestine Authority have been a complete and total failure, exactly as Edward Said predicted 27 years ago.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Dear Tikang, you are next, if you want.
Thanks very much, Prof, for that insight. That was quite alarming. I have a question. The making of U.S. foreign policy embodies principally four actors. That's the president, which covers the executive. We have the Congress, bureaucracy, and public opinion. Was this deal struck only by the president, or these other sub-three actors were part of the deal? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think one of the challenges that students living in the Arab Islamic world have is, how do we understand American foreign policy and decisions that are made with respect to the Middle East? So you're right in identifying these various actors. Fundamentally, these decisions were made by the Trump administration with, I think, backing from the Congress. I think public opinion in the United States, I think broadly is supportive of these peace agreements, largely because they don't know the background story. They don't know how the Palestinians are disproportionately affected. They don't know how these peace agreements are not peace agreements between Israel and the people of Bahrain, for example. These are peace agreements between Israel and the dictatorship in Bahrain. So they're very sort of weak series of agreements that, as I said, won't stand the test of time. But in the United States right now, people are focused on the coronavirus. People are focused on getting Donald Trump out of the White House. Public opinion in the United States on the question of Israel-Palestine overwhelmingly states, when you ask public opinion, that people support justice and peace for Israelis and Palestinians. And what's happened in the United States, at least over the last 20 or 25 years, is public opinion now has shifted significantly in a, I would argue, a healthy direction. Americans on university campuses in public opinion are very upset at US foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly with respect to its one-sided pro-Israel stance that denies the Palestinians basic human rights. The problem is that that growing public opinion doesn't make its way up to the Congress and to the White House, because when you get to that level of society, it's a battle between effective lobby groups, between segments of society that can mobilize people to win political battles in the Congress, in the White House. It's really about a question of effective, lobbying. And in that area, the right-wing pro-Israel narrative is 1,000,000 times stronger than the Palestine pro-justice narrative, even though if you had a public opinion survey in the United States, public opinion would support a very different US foreign policy toward the Israel-Palestine conflict. So that's how I view it. There was a lot of hope that if Bernie Sanders would have become president of the United States, and he had a chance, that we would have a very different US foreign policy. And I think Bernie Sanders' rise as a possible candidate was really driven by this changing public sentiment in the United States, a public sentiment that is growing, much more critical of US foreign policy toward the Middle East, very critical of the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu, that includes many American Jews who do not like what Netanyahu is doing in their name and want an honorable and decent peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. All of those things are positive developments. But at the level of political power, that's where money, influence, lobbying, and organization win the day. And in that particular battle, it's basically the supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu who dominate the debate.
Thank you so much. Next question coming from Vala, if you are ready.
Oh, yes. Hi, sir. Thank you, Axel, and thank you, sir, for the presentation. It's really impressive. So my question here, I'm going to be short. I'm Palestinian, by the way. And my question is that what's our turn? You're talking about our protesting and our leadership, and you can see the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas and all his the leadership in Palestine. They failed. Like they made a big failure, and they couldn't get our rights or anything. If we protest, people think of us as terrorists. If we make any kind of move, the whole world would think of Palestinians as terrorists. So, what do you suggest us to do?
I suggest that the first thing that needs to be done is that Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestine Authority have to be sort of thanked for their contributions and then ask them to leave. And there needs to be a new representative, incorruptible, and much more effective Palestinian leadership that comes to power that can organize the Palestinian national movement in the exact same way that Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress was able to organize South African society and global public opinion to defeat apartheid in South Africa. If you send me an email, I'll send you an article that was written about 20 years ago by the late Edward Said called Strategies of Hope. And it was an article that he wrote after he went to South Africa, after Mandela came out of jail. And he visited and talked to people in the African National Congress and asked them, what can Palestinians learn from the South African struggle against apartheid? And if you read that article, Edward Said lays out a set of arguments and suggestions in terms of how the Palestinians can turn around their fate, what they can learn from other national liberation struggles, what the Palestinian leadership has refused to do, but should be doing in order to fundamentally change the plight of the Palestinian people, which, as your question sort of suggests, every year is getting worse and is getting more difficult, largely because, in my view, the leadership of the Palestinian national movement is an embarrassment, is a colossal failure. And now is the moment for, for reflection and for rethinking and for, mobilization. So I think those are, broadly speaking, the things that Palestinians need to do if they hope to get out of this very difficult situation that they find themselves in. I hope that one of the good things that comes out of this very dangerous moment that we're in, particularly for Palestinians, is it might lead to the revival of a credible Palestinian national leadership that can then lead the Palestinians toward self-determination.
Thank you very much.
Dear Khalid, let's continue with you. Are you here, Khalid? Or we can continue.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Goxel. Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Nader. So you said something very important in your presentation, and it was related to the peace agreements brokered between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that these agreements, or there was a comment on them by the Minister of Defense, the Israeli Minister of Defense, mm-hmm. that these are brokered with dictators, and this kind of hints that on a social level, the real worry is on a social level, and as soon as power is in the hands of the populations, that's when these agreements will ultimately collapse. Mm-hmm. Now, keeping this in mind and looking at the situation that we're in right now, and especially in UAE and Bahrain, what do you have to say to the exaggerated promotion of social normalization and the images of it that have emerged in the past few months? And the images of it that have emerged in the past few months. Thank you.
I mean, I think those images are exaggerated. It's really the UAE. Look, the people of Bahrain are not going to Israel, and a lot of Israelis are not going to Bahrain, because the situation in Bahrain is that you have a minority sort of authoritarian regime ruling over a restless population. So a lot of these are, I think, exaggerated attempts to show that, look, the people of the Arab world broadly support normalization. If you listen to what Jared Kushner was saying in justifying these agreements, he was saying, look, the people of the Arab world don't care about Palestine. They're interested in technology, in economic development, in sort of, having, 5G bandwidth on their cell phones. And Israel has the promise of giving the Arabs that. So first of all, who died and left Jared Kushner spokesman for the wishes and desires of the Arab Islamic world? And second of all, the problem with these, stories is that it's really taking the United Arab Emirates as representative of the entire Arab Islamic world. I would argue that the Arab and Islamic world is much bigger, much more intellectually sophisticated, and much more ethically principled than the United Arab Emirates is. So, in many ways, it's really a distorted projection of reality, and often geared to satisfying Israeli and Western public opinion, as if, the United Arab Emirates represents the entire Islamic world.
Thank you so much. Dear Kavtar, you can ask directly.
Okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Nader, thank you so much for your presentation. I always enjoy your sessions. Sir, the future of the Palestinian-Israelian conflict is not clear. And as a proud Algerian, I don't really believe in peace with Israel. Sir, history keeps repeating itself, and Algeria got its independence after fighting not only France, but the whole NATO. This revolution came after the failure of our peaceful ways, until we got the lesson that says that what is taken by force can only be taken back by force. So, sir, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you see the future of this conflict, or how it will end? Thank you so much.
Look, I'm sympathetic to your question. I'm sympathetic to the right of people to mobilize, organize, and fight for their basic human rights. But I think we have to sort of go to the next level and have a much more detailed and much more specific conversation about effective strategies that can actually lead to national liberation and self-determination. We have to put slogans aside. If you actually study the concept of successful transitions to democracy, successful efforts to engage in civil resistance against authoritarian regimes, the overwhelming the documentary and factual evidence suggests that nonviolent movements for political change are much more successful. In fact, my colleague here at the University of Denver, who's recently moved to Harvard, her name is Erica Chenoweth. Look up her writings. She's actually studied this topic, and she's sort of considered to be one of the most influential intellectuals on this topic. She studied this topic and documented how nonviolent strategies for civil disobedience can lead to sort of democracy much more effectively. And so I think that's fundamentally the way to go. I'm not a pacifist. I believe people have the right to defend themselves, but I think we need to go to the next level and have a serious conversation about what strategies in what countries will be more effective than others. One of the big fears, and you're Algeria, I mean, you know this better than I do. Yes, Algeria fought a very courageous, heroic struggle for independence against France. But afterwards, the situation didn't really improve. You had the military that's in power and remains in power and has killed a lot of people, particularly during the Black Decade in the 1990s. And so Algeria has suffered, I think, tremendously from violence both from the state and from extremist elements in society connected to various extremist Islamist groups. One of the big fears that I have is that if we're not careful, violent strategies for political change can end up costing us much more down the road. I'm a strong believer in nonviolent civil resistance, one, because I think that's the right thing to do ethically. I also just think from a strategic perspective, you're more likely to be victorious if you engage in those types of acts of civil disobedience. And I think this also applies to the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you know the history of this conflict, the first Palestinian intifada in the late 1980s was overwhelmingly nonviolent. Israel was deeply shaken by that uprising. It didn't know how to respond. It suffered a huge public relations blow. I think there's lessons there for those people who are seriously interested in Palestinian rights to study and to learn from.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hashemi. I just saw that Professor Koons, who just recently, before yourself actually, gave an amazing presentation, he shared an article, and I was wondering if Professor Koons would like to share some of his insights on this topic or any remarks if he likes.
Oh, I don't want to take any time from this conversation. I just want to say that the Chenoweth and Stefan book is actually excellent, and I teach a couple of chapters from it when I teach political and social thought. It has some really good case studies about the Iranian Revolution, about the revolution in the Philippines, for example, examining, for example, talking about a lot of the reasons why nonviolent revolution tends to be successful. For example, the barriers to entry are a lot lower. You can get a lot more people participating. It's a really interesting and very accessible work, and very data-driven too. They have a very large data set explaining why, making their case for why they think, and as Professor Hashemi mentions, one of the things they argue for is that nonviolent revolutions are more likely to lead to democratic transitions rather than other kinds of transitions. So it's a book that I strongly recommend.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's such a great book that if you're interested in this topic, it's worth actually having an entire session on the book, to talk about how
that would be great. Yeah. Okay, shall we have two more questions and then?
Yeah, we have last two questions.
Yes, let's go.
Enu, we can continue with you, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Prof, for your presentation. It was really a discourse full of background and data. I think it's one of the discussions where I've had with many of my colleagues who are doing politics. It usually comes a bit confused to me, but maybe at a basic level, I just want to ask a question at a basic level, which I've never really had an answer to. What is the role that religious claims of God giving the land to Israel in religious texts have to do with the agreements and the problem that actually exists between Israel and Palestine at the moment? Thank you.
No, I mean, that's a good question. Some Israelis who live in Israel believe that they can't make peace with Palestinians because God has given the land to Israel, and that's the end of the story. Now, of course, if you believe that, then there's no room for compromise. There's only room for conflict. The fact of the matter is, if you know the history of Zionism, the founders of Zionism and the leaders in Israel today are not interested and are not motivated by those religious claims. They will manipulate those religious claims to mobilize people, but fundamentally the founders of the state of Israel were overwhelmingly secular. They were driven by different forms and understandings of European secular nationalism. And they, were driven by sort of the horrors of anti-Semitism in Europe and the need for the Jews to find a safe haven. I think leaders of Israel are not driven by those extremist religious claims. I think the reason why Israel refuses to make concessions to the Palestinians and continues to behave in this particular way is because Israel and its leaders are drunk on power. They're successful. They have the United States supporting them. They have Europe supporting them. And now, on top of everything else, they have Arab autocratic regimes that are in open alliance with them. So why should Israel give any concessions to the Palestinians when there's no pressure, when the balance between Israel and the Palestinians is so one-sided that Israel feels that it can continue behaving in this way? And I think the only way to change this equation is to change the balance of power so that Israel is forced to recalculate. And the way you change the balance of power is you need effective Palestinian leadership that can organize not only Palestinian society, but global public opinion in the same way that Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress did. You need to sort of fight different political battles in different theaters of conflict. And I'm talking about battles to win hearts and minds. And I think if you do that, then Israel will be forced to recalculate. I fundamentally believe that the biggest sort of battleground for justice for the Palestinians is here in the United States. If there's a shift in American policy, if you get Americans to start saying that, look, we're not going to subsidize Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank. If Israel wants American support, it has to respect international law and implement UN resolutions. These are the things that actually Bernie Sanders was saying, and he mobilized a lot of people, not just average Americans, but many American Jews around this particular narrative. Then I think Israel is going to start to recalculate. So I wouldn't put too much stock in these extremist religious claims. Now, there are people who believe that, but I don't think they're the decision makers in this particular conflict.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Let's finalize with Esnaira's question.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Nader, for a very engaging session. I want to take the discussion to the other actors that you haven't mentioned, because in the region, you know that there are other actors such as, like, for example, Turkey, Iran, Qatar, for example. How do you think it will play an impact to the ongoing Abrahamic and how do you think it will affect it?
Yeah, well, look, I think every individual country is, at least the leaders of those countries are pursuing their own national interests. So Turkey is pursuing its own interest. It's very publicly supportive of the Palestinians, but at the same time, Israel has diplomatic relations with Israel. Turkey has diplomatic relations with Israel. In fact, Turkey was one of the first countries in the region to establish diplomatic relations with Israel way back in the early days of this conflict. And even when the AK party and Erdogan came to power, those relations basically stayed intact. So Turkey is going to pursue its own relations and its own position based on a calculation of its own interests. Iran the same, and Qatar the same. And I think this is partially part of the problem. Before these accords, there was a position in the Arab League, also supported by the Organization of Islamic Conference, that if Israel wanted recognition, if Israel wanted to be included in the neighborhood, then it had to, and it must, as a precondition, recognize Palestinian national rights, give Palestinians a little bit of land, a little bit of justice. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing over the last years in the Abraham Accords is the sort of public manifestation of this, is that position is no longer adhered to by major countries in the region. Not the ones that you mentioned, but Saudi Arabia, the the Emirates, Bahrain, and now these other countries who basically have been cajoled, pressured, bribed into making deals with Israel, largely at the request of the White House right now, and largely in support of Israel's colonial claims over Palestinian lands. That's fundamentally what's happening here. So I think one of the ways that you can sort of think about this is there has to be some sort of united position. There has to be some sort of shift. One reason why many of us are critical of the Abraham Accords is because now Israel has no incentive to make any concessions to the Palestinians. Before, the overwhelming position established by international law, supported by most countries in the world, including in the Arab Islamic world, was that in exchange for recognizing Israel, Israel would have to give land concessions. But now Israel is getting recognized without giving up any concessions. So why should Israel change its behavior or treat the Palestinians better when those incentives are no longer there? So this is fundamentally the problem.
Thank you so much, dear all. I guess Q&A session completed right now.
Perfect.
Back to
Perfect.
you.
Thank you, Professor Hashemi, Mr. Göksel, and Professor Koons, all the participants, all the comments. I have never ever seen 5 hands actually on that screen who are trying to ask questions, and I know many more. It's just really kind of, I think today was one of the remarkable sessions, and we are extremely grateful to everyone. And tomorrow, what's going to happen, Mr. Göksel? Please share the exciting news.
With Word Cafe, and we will start 2 ideation sessions, ideation phase in the human-centered design. Please don't forget to join this session. It's more important to continue your human-centered design process. Okay, guys? And I will share all information in the general channel.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
See you soon.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Stay safe. Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.
Ma salama. Bye-bye.